Okay, I'm going to start with a quote, and I'm going to get you to guess who said the quote. Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. The world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. Any guesses of the category of person that said this? Wrong. Dwight D. Eisenhower, U.S. president who oversaw the Korean War, right? Invaded South Korea to back up the U.S. puppet dictator who ran the place back in the 50s. Okay. The reason I bring up this quote is because, like, the whole session, the session is titled "How Capitalism Breeds War." And socialists have a particular explanation for why wars happen under capitalism, and that explanation dispenses entirely with the notion that war is caused by moral failings, greed, that sort of thing. So just to give you a taster, you've probably all heard variations of these explanations before. Wars happen because some countries are just evil, right? But it's fine when we do it. So Winston Churchill in 1938 goes and says, regarding the impending World War II, does anyone pretend that preparation for resistance to aggression is unleashing war? I declare it to be the sole guarantee of peace, he said. We get told that sometimes leaders are just greedy. We get told that freedom isn't free. We have to protect our freedoms. We have to protect what is ours. So this is Otto von Bismarck, right? German chancellor, who says, the great questions of the day are not decided by speeches and majority votes, but by blood and iron, right? And there is also an explanation that is quite common amongst people who get involved in activism, which is that it's just an aspect of human nature. Like, we are just inhumane to each other. We are just cruel to each other. It's something in our human nature. And today I sort of want to go into the Marxist explanation for why wars happen, which I think you will find is a rejoinder, a rebuttal to many of these to many of these arguments. Okay, so I'm going to make a few assumptions in the talk today. The first assumption I'm going to make is that we all accept that war is bad, right? I'm not going to attempt to convince you of that. That should be self-evident. The other is that there's actually quite a lot of them going on. I went to Wikipedia while I was researching this talk, and this map shows everywhere on Earth where there is a war currently happening. It is most of the world. Now, this map does not include all the countries who are involved in the war, only where the wars are happening. And the darker the color, the more people have died in that war this year, right? So it looks like most of the world appears to be at war. Now, why is this? You all learned in school that World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars. That didn't happen, right? Now, the Marxist explanation for why capitalism causes war centers around a theory of imperialism. Normally, I would try to use a case study to go through this, and I will do a little bit of that later with Ukraine, but I would imagine that most people here are neck deep in Palestine activism, and so you can probably relate the theory that I'm about to tell you to some kind of practical application. So I'm just going to go through the theory, right, and then we can flesh out any applications of that in the discussion. Okay, so the Marxist theory of imperialism, right? We start from some quite basic principles. Capitalism is a system of competition between capitalists and between firms, right? Capitalists compete with each other in order to obtain profit. As this happens, the more successful capitalists gain the ability to either defeat, push out, or absorb the weaker capitalists, which means that the size of companies under capitalism tends to grow over time. They tend to get bigger and bigger. At the same time, under capitalism, and you can see this in history for countries that have transitioned from feudalism to capitalism, from a system which was ruled by kings and lords to a merchant capitalist system, and today to an industrial capitalist system, that the typical structure of a state under capitalism is that of a nation state, the kind that we have today. Now, why is this? A state achieves a bunch of things which are useful for capitalism as a whole and for capitalists who run the firms. the state can guarantee the conditions for profit. The state can ensure that you as a capitalist obtain raw materials, a labor supply, a market to sell your goods to, a common set of laws in order to trade under, and a language in which to conduct those trades. And the state can also mediate disputes between different sections of capital when they come into conflict. So we have, on the one hand, firms which are getting bigger and bigger, and a nation state which sort of oversees the market within a country. Eventually what happens is that the firms grow big enough that they become important keystones of the national economy. And so the nation state, which oversees all of this, is induced into looking after the interests of these very large firms, and in turn the very large firms begin to directly lobby and influence the nation state in order to look out for their interests, right? Who are these firms, right? They're usually the big ones. They're usually the strategic important ones. It's the strategically important ones. So if you look at a list today of very large, very important companies, you will find oil and gas companies, car companies, tech companies, right? These are the companies which predominate the market in the major capitalist countries, and these are the companies that in an indirect and a direct sense are involved in imperialist competition. So nation states come to depend on these big capitalists in order to maintain their competitiveness against other nations, because at this point the capitalist nations are all competing against each other. And here's where it turns to the question of war. Nations will deploy the resources of the state to secure the conditions of profit for these companies, either inside the territory of the country or internationally. They can do this by direct investment. They can do this by trade agreements or deals. They can do this by crushing unions and any other kind of struggle that prevents the companies from getting the resources they need, or they can do it by direct military intervention. And of course, nations may form alliances with each other in order to achieve these goals, so that blocks of nations and their associated big capitalists can secure their profits. And when these alliances form, these blocks of nations become rivals, and these entire alliances may end up going to war with each other. So you can see from the simple principle of capitalism involves competition for profit, and it has a state which oversees its interests. We can step our way up to the situation where we have now, where we have blocks of countries which dominate most of the world. They're all advanced industrial powers with very large militaries held up by by that industrial capacity, and they are constantly trying to go to war with each other. So just to sort of hammer home this point, I'll pull a quote from Chris Harman, who is one of the big theorists of our tendency from back in Britain, and this is from an article in the International Socialist Journal titled "The State and Capitalism Today." Even in periods of peace, the relations between the different capitals are not simply dependent, as in Marx's model in Capital, on their market relations. They're not simply dependent on market relations. Conditions are those of an armed peace, in which the relative influence of the different states helps determine the relative success of the different blocks of capital associated with them. The more military power a bloc has, the better it can ensure conditions of success for its own capitalists. And this relative influence depends at the end of the day on their ability to accumulate military hardware. It is this which determines their ability to build empires, acquire client states, and create alliances. Right? Okay, so we find that as capitalism becomes a global system, which is what happened over the past 200-300 years, right, the competition between capitalist nation states ends up generating the system of relationships and behaviors that we call imperialism. Right? Imperialism is a naturally emerging phenomenon that comes out of capitalism. Okay, so I'm going to go into a bit of a case study now with Ukraine. I've chosen not to do Gaza because you've probably discussed a lot of Gaza, and there's a lot more Gaza to go in the program. And I also feel that Ukraine actually sort of illustrates the point a bit more clearly. So in the case of Ukraine, the war that's sort of going on now in Ukraine between Russia on the one side and NATO on the other started, in fact, back in 2014. And you can argue that its roots go all the way back to the fall of the Berlin Wall, right? When Russia began to withdraw its influence from Eastern Europe. Okay, at the time, right, since Russia's influence in Eastern Europe was waning, NATO, which had the nations of Western Europe as its allies, had two choices. They could have chosen to simply stay there and be relieved that they were no longer on a border with their imperial rival, which could have caused a war, or they could have chosen to push further and further towards Russia, which is exactly what they ended up doing, right? So in 2014, when Ukraine has an election, which is preceded by a coup, that's a whole other story. The Ukrainian state begins to commit to joining NATO, and it is this which, in fact, triggers the Russians to at first invade Crimea and set up the escalating tensions, which in 2021 broke out into a full-scale war. None of this is to excuse anything that Russia has done. You will see from our analysis so far that this is simply us attempting to predict what happens when two big capitalist blocs have a chunk of land, a chunk of resources, a chunk of political influence that they would like control over, right? And so it's this setup, a rivalry between Russia, a recently defeated imperial power which is looking to build itself back up, and the U.S., which is looking to assert its influence in the European region. In the background of this is the even larger global scale rivalry between the U.S. and China. The U.S. would like to demonstrate to China that it is able to project power halfway around the world. Implication being that if China decides to mess with the U.S., that the U.S. can militarily challenge them and hold their territory. The other useful thing to flesh out of the case of Ukraine is what happens in terms of how to end the war. So we'll talk about this a little bit later on in terms of what all this theory means for us trying to stop wars. But I just want to go through a bit of a line of thinking about what happens if the war is concluded in the usual way, which is by a military defeat of one side over the other. Because we're constantly told this. We're constantly told we got to send weapons to Ukraine, because if we don't, then the Russians are going to pile weapons in and they're going to win the war and it's all going to be very bad, right? Okay? What happens if we continue sending weapons? What happens if NATO outright wins the war against Russia, pushes Russia completely out of Ukraine, regains Donbass, regains the Crimea? What happens then, right? Unless we completely pummel the entire Russian army into nothing, Russia is going to try and build back its forces. It's going to have a reason to resent what has happened to it, and whatever new border is created between Ukraine and Russia is going to be the front of the next big confrontation between Russia and the Ukraine. One of the core conclusions of the Marxist theory of imperialism is that military defeats do not result in peace, right? You don't win wars by militarily winning wars. You win wars by making sure the wars don't happen, right? Which is what we're going to talk about right about now. Okay, so why is it important that we correctly identify that capitalism and imperialism are the cause of war, not some moral failing, not a quirk of this country being particularly aggressive and so on? Why is it important that we identify capitalism as the cause? The history of the theory itself can give us a bit of an indication. The first time that Marxists developed a proper theory of imperialism was under the Bolsheviks, Lenin and Bukharin, back in 1916 and 1917. And you may remember from history class that what else was happening in the world in 1916 and 1917 was that we were in the midst of a First World War, right? There was immense brutality going on in the trenches of Europe, right? Thousands of soldiers were being sacrificed on both sides of a single trench in order to move one trench forward and one trench back, poison gas, tanks, the works, right? In this context, you would imagine that the socialist parties of Europe, which before the war had all committed to opposing war, would oppose the war, but they did not. Most of them did not. Most of them folded. Some of them were simply not staunch in their convictions. Others actually had theories to sort of back up their support of their own imperial governments. So, for example, Karl Kautsky, who ran the German Socialist Party, argued that as the global economy became more interconnected, then the likelihood of war would decrease. Why would Germany, for example, go to war with Britain when they're both huge trading partners with each other? We can see the very same argument playing out now. Australia and China, huge trading partners. America and China are both trading partners, huge trading partners. Why would they possibly go to war with each other, right? This is the context in which Lenin and Bukharin develop the theory of imperialism, which shows precisely that even as countries trade with each other, they are also rivals. They also form blocs. They also seek to control resources and deny resources to each other, which is why they do all of these horrible things that happen in war. Okay, so, yes, got it. So, I'm just going to rattle off a list of important conclusions right about now. Just a bunch of conclusions that can be drawn. The most important thing is that workers do not have an interest in war, no matter which nation we are from. When a war is fought between two imperial countries, the workers of both of those nations lose out. The workers are the ones who have to have their working conditions quashed. They are the ones who will have their freedom of speech limited. If they protest against the war, they will be branded traitors and dealt with as that state sees fit. And ultimately, they are the ones sent to die in the trenches to actually fight the war. Capitalism uses war in a similar way that it uses nationalism. It tries to bind workers to its own interests and suppress dissent. And the contrary is true for us. Workers have a common interest with each other, even across enemy nations, especially across enemy nations. It follows then that if capitalism is the thing that causes war, then weakening capitalism is what's going to allow us to stop a war. So we make the slogans, right? The classic slogans: "A blow to imperialism somewhere weakens imperialism everywhere." Now, what does that mean? We, as socialists, challenge imperialism, we challenge war, we challenge capitalism because that helps to smash chauvinist ideas among workers of the imperial power. So we workers here in Australia, right? If we can convince workers here to fight against Australian imperialism, then that helps them convince them that the Australian state has no right to dominate our neighbors in the Pacific, has no right to bully our neighbors in the Southeast, has no right to dominate the indigenous people of this continent, and it also offers oppressed peoples a window to fight for their own liberation. There's a whole bunch of examples of this. East Timor was liberated by a Portuguese revolution halfway around the world that was barely even thinking about it, right? But when the Portuguese tried to throw off their dictator in 1974, they inadvertently gave the East Timorese a window to fight for their own independence. It took a while longer than that. Long story. We're not going to get into it, but that's just one example. Another important slogan: the main enemy is at home, right? We focus on our imperial power here instead of necessarily on another imperial power over there. Why is this important? We want to make it clear that the way that when we struggle against our own ruling class here, it's the same working class who wants to suppress our working conditions, who wants to stamp out dissent, who wants to send us off to die in the wars. The better organized we are here to fight our own ruling class allows us to both challenge the warmongers and to improve our own working conditions. It's also important that we show the workers of the enemy nations that we have common cause with each other. If you were at Simon Assaf's session earlier, you would have heard that the boat blockades, which are being conducted here, are being beamed into the homes of Arabs all across the Middle East. 200 million of them are watching, and they have been told their entire lives, the West hates you. You need to follow the king, the sultan, the general, because it's the only way that you'll be safe. And we have been told all our lives that these Arabs are a bunch of uneducated religious nut jobs that don't know how to do democracy and all of that, right? When we struggle here and we reach out to workers of the enemy nations, we break down that parochialism. As the saying goes, we try and turn the imperial war into a class war, a class struggle. And the last conclusion to be drawn is that we can in fact use industrial struggle in order to challenge wars. That was the slogan under the Vietnam War: "Stop war to stop the war." Right? We want to deny the ruling class the means to prosecute the war. They can't fight a war unless we make them their bullets and their guns and their profits and unless we sign up as soldiers. Right? Without this, the wars don't happen. Okay? We want to pry open the political and ideological space to resist the war. Even if you don't work in a workplace that is directly implicated in a supply chain, right? It's important. Like teachers aren't directly implicated in the supply chain, but we have massive influence over students and over society in general. So that's the reason why the ruling class pushes back so hard on teachers who try to speak out, and it's the reason why it is valuable, even for those workers, to organize, to be able to speak, to challenge the ideology of war. And of course, we get to break the unjust laws that get used against anti-war activists and union activists and climate activists and every other sort of activist. It's the same laws, it's the same ruling class. When we struggle to stop the war, we weaken the ruling class's hold on us. So if that all sounds good to you, keep turning up to the Marxism 101 sessions. You'll hear more about this sort of analysis. I'll put a plug out to you to join Solidarity, because it is this precise politics that has informed all of the work that Soli is doing so far in the Palestine struggle. You need to get involved. I will invite you to dive into whatever it is there is to discuss in the Q&A, and we'll come back and wrap it up afterwards.
Thanks so much for a lunch break, and you will be able to get some wraps and snacks or something just outside the foyer there. And yeah, if you have been inspired by what we've been saying so far this morning in this session as well, do join us, do get actively involved in Solidarity. Yeah, we are socialists, we take revolution really seriously, and we also take the idea of fighting back and building the power to stop the war, stop the attacks on Palestinian people, but also to stop all wars, future wars. Thanks so much, Jason. I might give you 5 minutes.
Sure. Thanks for the discussion, everyone. I'll just sort of address the points one by one. I'll start with something that I want to just sort of add in upon reflecting about how the talk came out, which is the idea of state capture. I talked a lot about how imperialism comes from an interplay between large firms and the states, which try to look after their interests. And this leads some people to be of the opinion that in modern capitalism, states are completely under the sway of big corporations, that Australia is just doing the bidding of Rio Tinto and Woolworths and Qantas and whatever, which is not quite the case, right? It's a bit more complicated. That the state, as usual, is looking out for the interests of the ruling class as a whole. These interests may conflict with the interests of any one section of the ruling class, and they're playing a longer game. So just to give an example, a lot of people argue that the reason that the U.S. invaded Iraq was to get the oil, okay? And that's sort of true, but then the argument became, okay, they wanted to get the oil for this particular oil company, Halliburton, that Dick Cheney had a connection with. It's a bit more complicated than that. Like a bunch of comrades argued, this is a strategic thing. The U.S. has huge oil supplies already. What they wanted to do was deny the oil present in Iraq to one of its rivals. They didn't want Russia and China to be able to access the oil, and they reckoned that the most effective way to do that was to simply invade the place and install a puppet government. It didn't turn out so well, but that was their calculation. Okay, right now responses. Comrade at the front talking about wars before capitalism. Okay, it's true. Wars did exist before capitalism. The concept of total war is famously a Roman concept. So we have states and empires arising before capitalism, which did become expansionist, which did try to claim territory, which were rivals with their neighboring states. But the impetus for these states to do these things, whether they be religious or like an immediate material rivalry with a neighbor, that was a lot weaker under feudalism. It was very rare that you had a situation where an empire would just decide to go hog and try and conquer its neighbors. The point that Aramat raised, if you want to put it pithily, is that the limit of a lord's greed is the walls of his stomach, right? Like under feudalism, when you amass wealth, you amass physical wealth, you amass gold, you amass grain, you amass stuff. right? The idea of like money as this ethereal number on a spreadsheet which turns into capital which you can invest didn't exist at the time. That is what is driving competition between states right now. That is why every single nation, big and small, is forcibly plugged into the system of imperialism because it has to play this game if it wants to stay afloat. Right? And that's precisely why none of these capitalist states are ever going to be the ones that liberate us from the imperial system. We have to do it ourselves. So there's that. Okay, right. Peter raised 2 points regarding the spread of revolutions. I think it's important for us to, actually think about the mechanics of how revolutions spread and the mechanics of how workers fight under situations like ours to stop wars and potentially win revolutions of their own. I don't think, for example, like when you put the question, Peter, and I understand very much where this comes from, that if it's hard enough to have a revolution in one country, how can we possibly spread it, right? And I'd like to pick that apart a little. I don't think it's the national borders necessarily that are the main obstacle to a revolution spreading from one country to another. I think it's the clarity of, I think it's the level of organization outside and the political clarity on the outside that is going to be the main struggle. You know, like we're watching this right now in Gaza with respect to the workers of the Middle East. How clear are the workers of the Middle East that their ruling classes are also complicit in what is happening in Gaza, and do they know what to do about it? Okay, we're seeing the beginnings of this. We're beginning to see that the workers in Jordan are beginning to twig that they have to challenge the king. And you know, you see the workers in the Mahala fabric plant in Egypt coming on strike again. If this spreads into a larger strike movement, then we will see the workers understand that the best thing they can do to support Gaza is effectively, even if this isn't their overt target, to create a revolutionary situation inside of Egypt, to challenge the generals to the point that they either step down or can be removed and can be replaced with a government that does carry out the will of the workers. Okay, Pine Gap. Question about Pine Gap. Thanks. We pondered this a lot when we consider like individual cases of like, okay, there's a facility here and we need to shut it down and so on. Like I'll sort of it's probably best if I talk about it directly. Okay. In general terms, I would say if we want to shut down Pine Gap, we need to create a hostile environment for Pine Gap, and that can happen in all sorts of different ways. The key thing under capitalism is to remember that nothing is completely isolated. Pine Gap is not an isolated operation. The soldiers that staff Pine Gap have to fly in and out from somewhere. They have to get their groceries somewhere. They have to get their oil somewhere. The electricity that goes to the radar dishes goes somewhere, right? Pine Gap is not an isolated system. Every section of that system which makes Pine Gap work is run by workers. In general, what we've been talking about in this session is that war does not happen unless workers are involved in making the stuff, in doing the labor, right? And so if we find those weak points and we manage to convince those workers by whatever arguments are available to us that they should down tools, Pine Gap stops working, right? And in general, this is true about, you know, like we're breaking from the U.S. alliance. This could be, you know, materially, we stop a facility from running. It could be completely ideological, right? There's a role for every worker to play in making it so untenable and so uncomfortable for Australia to maintain its alliance with the U.S. that it simply punches out. And from there, we will have weakened the Australian state significantly. There's, you know, a chance that we might very well have like a semi-revolutionary situation on our hands. It depends on the level of organization that we have and the level of power that we hold. Okay, finally, I want to go to contribution from Comrade up front. Who's paying for all these wars? We want to be very clear. The workers pay for it. Like, we are the ones who pay for it with blood and with our stolen wages, right? And like it's a cost that our ruling classes are willing to stomach because it's not actually their cost. They push the cost on. They push the cost onto us, and they reckon that it's worth, sabotaging their own trade connections, sabotaging their immediate profitability, even if it means that they think they can come out on top in the gamble of the imperial game.